Jason, and this is your commentary on Leviticus chapter 4. Now, this is going to be the fourth sacrifice or offering that God is asking the Israelites to do. This time, it's the sin offering. The Lord spoke to Moses. He said, "Speak to the Israelites. Tell them, suppose someone sins without meaning to, and that person does something the Lord commands us not to do. Suppose it is the anointed priest who sins, and suppose he brings guilt on the people. Then he must bring a young bull to the Lord. It must not have any flaws. He must bring it as a sin offering for the sin he has committed. He must bring the bull to the entrance to the tent of meeting in the sight of the Lord. He must place his hand on its head. He must kill it there in the sight of the Lord. Then the anointed priest must take some of the bull's blood. He must carry it into the tent of meeting. He must dip his finger into the blood. He must sprinkle some of it 7 times in the sight of the Lord. He must do it in the front of the curtain of the most holy room. Then the priest must put some of the blood on the horns of the altar for burning incense. The horns stick out from the upper 4 corners of the altar. The incense burned on that altar has a sweet smell. The altar stands in front of the Lord in the tent of meeting. The priest must pour out some of the rest of the bull's blood at the bottom of the altar for burnt offerings. That altar stands at the entrance to the tent. He must remove all the fat from the bull for the sin offering. It includes the fat that is connected to the inside parts. It includes both kidneys with the fat on them next to the lower back muscles. It also includes the long part of the liver. He must remove all of it together with the kidneys. He must remove it in the same way the fat is removed from an ox sacrificed as a friendship offering. Then the priest must burn all of it on the altar for burnt offerings. But the bull's hide must be taken away. So must all its meat. So must its head and legs. And so must its inside parts and guts. In other words, all the rest of the bull must be taken away. The priest must take it outside the camp. He must take it to a clean place. He must take it to a place where the ashes are thrown. Then he must burn it there in a wood fire on a pile of ashes. So if the priest is the one that sins, then they have to take a young bull. And they take it, they sacrifice it, they sprinkle the blood inside the tent of meeting, by the curtain and by the gold incense altar that they have. Then they take the other parts of the bull out to the altar out there, the bronze one, which was used for burnt offerings. They don't burn the entire thing. They just do the kidneys, the liver, the fatty part. The rest of the animal has to be burned outside of the entire area. Now that's for the high priest or any of the priests. God's going to ask the same thing of anybody. And so it's going to be a little bit repetitious here. But honestly, he wants to emphasize that everybody, doesn't matter who you are, needs to use this offering or sacrifice whenever they sin. Or suppose the whole community of Israel sins without meaning to. He's moving on to the next group of people. They do something the Lord commands us not to do. Suppose they realize their guilt, and suppose their sin becomes known. Then they must bring a young bull as a sin offering. They must offer it in front of the tent of meeting. The elders of the community must place their hands on the bull's head in the sight of the Lord. The bull must be killed in the sight of the Lord. Then the anointed priest must take some of the bull's blood into the tent of meeting. He must dip his finger into the blood. He must sprinkle it 7 times in the sight of the Lord. He must do it in front of the curtain. He must put some of the blood on the horns that stick out from the upper 4 corners of the altar. The altar stands in front of the Lord in the tent of meeting. The priest must pour out the rest of the blood at the bottom of the altar for burnt offerings. That altar stands at the entrance to the tent. He must remove all the fat from the bull. He must burn it on the altar. He must do the same thing with the bull as he did with the bull for the sin offering. When he does, he will pay for the sin of the community, and they will be forgiven. Then he must take the bull outside the camp. He must burn it just as he burned the first bull. It is a sin offering for the whole community. Or suppose a leader sins without meaning to. He disobeys any of the commands of the Lord his God. And suppose he realizes his guilt and his sin becomes known. Then he must bring an offering. It must be a male goat. It must not have any flaws. He must place his hand on the goat's head. He must kill it. He must do it at the place where the animals for burnt offerings are killed, in the sight of the Lord. His offering is a sin offering. Then the priest must dip his finger into some of the blood of the sin offering. He must put it on the horns that stick out from the upper four corners of the altar for burnt offerings. He must pour out the rest of the blood at the bottom of the altar. He must burn all the fat on the altar. He must burn it in the same way he burned the fat of the friendship offering. When he does, he will pay for the sin of the leader, and the leader will be forgiven. Or support. I was hoping to get away without editing. Or suppose someone in the community sins without meaning to. They disobey any of the Lord's commands. And suppose they realize their guilt, and their sin becomes known. Then they must bring an offering for the sin they have committed. It must be a female goat. It must not have any flaws. They must place their hand on the head of the animal for the sin offering. It must be killed at the place where the animals for burnt offerings are killed. Then the priest must dip his finger into some of the blood. He must put it on the horns that stick out from the upper four corners of the altar for burnt offerings. He must pour out the rest of the blood at the bottom of the altar. They must remove all the fat in the same way the fat is removed from the friendship offering. The priest must burn it on the altar. Its smell pleases the Lord. When the priest burns the offering, he will pay for their sin, and they will be forgiven. Suppose someone brings a lamb as their sin offering. Then they must bring a female animal. It must not have any flaws. They must place their hand on its head. They must kill it as a sin offering. They must do it at the place where the animals for burnt offerings are killed. Then the priest must dip his finger into some of the blood of the sin offering. He must put it on the horns that stick out from the upper four corners of the altar for burnt offerings. He must pour out the rest of the blood at the bottom of the altar. They must remove all the fat in the same way the fat is removed from the lamb for the friendship offering. The priest must burn it on the altar on top of the food offerings presented to the Lord. When he does, he will pay for the sin they have committed, and they will be forgiven. This one's all about the sin offering. And when I talk to people about the gospel message, and it's the message that we can be forgiven, I hear over and over again people say, yeah, but I'm a good person. Well, that's what this addresses, right? In all of these situations, it says that they did it without meaning. They didn't know that they were sinning. But when it was brought to their attention, that's when they gave the sin offering. See, a lot of times we think of the gospel message that God can forgive people being for the evil people, the bad people. And it's easy for us to look at ourselves as being good and say, well, it's not really for us. The truth is, all of us have sinned. Every one of us. And I know this, especially because I have a bunch of kids. And the kids tell me the same thing over and over again. When they hurt one another, or they do something to upset one another, they'll tell me, well, I didn't try to do it. I didn't mean to hurt them. Well, I know you didn't mean to, but you still need to ask for forgiveness. All parents teach their kids to say they're sorry and ask for forgiveness, even if they didn't mean to hurt the other person. Well, if that's the case, weren't we all kids once? We even say, well, I'm only human, which means that we admit that we are not perfect. God's giving us a chance here to be forgiven, not just when we're being evil, but just when we make mistakes. Even in that situation, we still need forgiveness, but luckily, God's given us a way to get it. Well, that's it for commentary on Leviticus chapter 4. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you guys next time.